In the interest of time, we are expecting a number of other members, but we are going to start since we have a hard stop today at noon. The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to examine the cybersecurity efforts at our nation's ports. We're pleased today to be joined by Admiral Paul Thomas, who's the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy for the United States Coast Guard, and Mr. Gregory Wilshushin, close, Director of Information Security Issues for the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Randy Parsons, who's Director of Security Services for the Port of Long Beach, California, and Mr. Jonathan Sawicki, who is the Security Improvement Program Manager for the ports of Harlingen and Brownsville, Texas. And we appreciate all of our witnesses coming this morning. I'd also at this time ask UC that the gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan, a member of the full committee, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing as well. And without objection, so ordered. We appreciate his interest in this subject. And you know, before we start, I think all of us certainly offer our thoughts and prayers to the family of the 33 crew members of El Fargo, which was just a very terrible, tragic event that certainly reminds us all of the force of Mother Nature. But the Coast Guard men and women that went out and performed all the services, the rescues, and as it goes forward, we certainly thank all of them for their service all the time. But there was on vivid display, certainly. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the vulnerability of seaports to cyber attacks and how well prepared we are to prevent and respond to such an attack. Today, this is going to be the first congressional hearing really convened to examine cybersecurity at our nation's ports, which I think is fitting since October, actually, is also National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. The Coast Guard is a government agency responsible for the physical security of our nation's port infrastructures. In working through the area maritime security committees, the Coast Guard partners with port authorities and operators to update access controls, fence off sensitive areas of the ports, and increase surveillance when appropriate, certainly. Since 9/11, Congress has appropriated $2.4 billion in port security grant funds to harden port facilities against the potential of a terror attack. And as a nation, I think we've done a fairly good job of updating the physical security at the ports, but we certainly have concerns that remain about whether or not the cybersecurity at our ports is adequate. Under the Maritime Transportation Security Act of '02, the Coast Guard was granted responsibility for the protection of communication systems, including information that flows through the maritime transportation system. Port facilities and ship operators, like many industries in America, are relying, certainly increasingly, on automation to streamline operations, and why those kinds of innovations certainly reduce time and lower the cost of doing business. They also carry a risk. Terror groups, nation states, criminal organizations, hackers, and even disgruntled employees could breach these systems with potentially catastrophic results to the nation's economy. More than $1 trillion of goods, from cars to oil to corn and everything in between, move through the nation's seaports each and every year. Increasingly, cargo is moving through our ports using automated industrial control systems, and these systems are controlling machinery on ports that move containers or fill tanks and load and offload ships. And I understand that the Port of Long Beach and port partners are working toward building perhaps the most automated and efficient container terminal in the United States. So we'll be looking forward to that testimony from Mr. Parsons about that, and why this automation has certainly a lot of benefits. It doesn't come without risks. In 2014, a major U.S. port facility suffered a system disruption that shut down a significant number of ship-to-shore cranes for several hours. In Europe, drug smugglers attempted to hack into cargo tracking systems to rearrange containers and to hide their drugs. A foreign military is suspected of compromising several systems aboard a commercial ship contracted by the U.S. Transportation Control. These breaches in the maritime domain are certainly concerning, not only from an economic standpoint, but because of the dangerous cargo such as liquefied natural gas and other certain dangerous cargoes that pass through the nation's seaports. If a cyber breach were to occur that tampered with the industrial control systems that monitor these cargoes, it could potentially allow the release of very, very dangerous chemicals. The private sector, of course, owns the ports and must clearly protect its own interests. However, the Department of Homeland Security has to be involved to ensure communication between ports nationwide. Information sharing will undoubtedly be part of any solution that we look to protect our seaports, and we have to have a strategy that looks beyond individual ports. Just as we have hardened physical security, we need to do the same in the virtual space for systems critical to the maritime transportation system to protect against malicious actors. The first step in reducing this risk is to conduct risk assessments. The Coast Guard has not yet conducted cyber risk assessments, though some individual ports have taken the initiative themselves. Port security grants can certainly be a way to help port operators make wise choices based on an individual assessment of risk. And in providing that grant funding, however, we certainly need to understand which ports are at risk of a cyber incident. Retooling the maritime security risk analysis model to incorporate cyber risk is a concept worth exploring further, and incorporating it into the port security grant program as well. And then finally, I think we need to better understand how the Department of Homeland Security, through the National Protection of Programs and the National Cybersecurity and Communication Integration Center, interfaces with the U.S. Coast Guard's cyber efforts. This is a very technical field, which may or may not be outside of the expertise of the Coast Guard inspector. So despite the exposure for proprietary information, we're wondering whether or not third-party validators authorized by the Coast Guard, who would have oversight of such a thing, could they review and certify cybersecurity standards? So perhaps there's some merit in looking at that model for cybersecurity. We'd be interested in pursuing that as well. I certainly want to thank the witnesses for appearing before us. I'm going to give you a more formal introduction in just a moment, but the chair now recognizes our ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vila, for any statement that he may have.
Chairman Miller, thank you for holding today's hearing to discuss the threat of cyber attack at ports and what the U.S. Coast Guard and the Department of Homeland Security are doing with private and public partners to protect maritime critical infrastructure against such attacks. And I thank all our witnesses for being here with us today. Since the Coast Guard is responsible for the security of our nation's ports, entities both in the private sector and in local and state government rely on the service's leadership when doing their part to mitigate risks at our ports. As ranking member of the subcommittee and as a member representing a district along the Gulf of Mexico, I have an interest in port security issues and recognize the unique challenges each port faces. Texas District 34 includes 4 maritime ports: the Port of Brownsville, Port of Harlingen, Port Isabel, and Port Mansfield, and is adjacent to the Port of Corpus Christi, which is represented by Congressman Farenthold. Each of these ports has its own set of characteristics, managing various volumes and types of cargo and other commercial traffic. One of the differences is, for example, the Port of Brownsville, the Port of Harlingen are about 17 miles inland, whereas the Port of Corpus Christi is right adjacent to a city of 300,000 people. And I've met with the chief of police at the Port of Corpus Christi, and I know he has some concerns about some of the vulnerabilities there, and I look forward to hearing about that. As with other ports, facilitating the flow of commerce must be judiciously balanced with measures required to keep our ports secure. As in my district, many of our nation's ports are closely linked to other vital transportation networks and critical infrastructure, which often lead to major metropolitan areas. Traditionally, our focus has been on the physical security of these ports. Today, we will discuss an important element that is growing and rapidly evolving: the use of technology at ports and the security risks posed by our increased reliance on these automated and networked systems. There is no question that technology can enhance the operations and security of seaports, which in turn helps boost economies through the import and export of goods. This technology also adds an additional level of risk that we must better understand and mitigate. Though this subcommittee does not typically discuss cybersecurity, it is important that we understand the federal government's role in this important port security issue. Last June, the Government Accountability Office issued a report on cybersecurity at ports. Its findings highlighted several actions the Coast Guard and DHS as a whole should take in order to better prepare for and ideally prevent cyber attacks on systems used at seaports. In June, the Coast Guard published their cyber strategy, which discussed the need to include cybersecurity as an element of security regimes for maritime critical infrastructure. Today, I hope to better understand how the GAO's findings influenced Coast Guard cyber strategy and how it will help inform implementation of the strategy. I would like to learn more about how the Coast Guard is developing guidance and standards that will address safety and security concerns while being sufficiently flexible for ports around the country. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions. What works in Long Beach may well not work best for Brownsville, for example. I also hope to hear directly from our port witnesses today about how ports of different types and sizes are addressing cybersecurity and what more the Coast Guard, DHS, and Congress can do to support your efforts. I am hopeful that today's hearing will broaden this subcommittee's understanding of the emerging risks related to technology at our ports. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman very much. Again, we're pleased to be joined by four very distinguished witnesses today to discuss this very important topic. And in way of a more formal introduction, Rear Admiral Paul Thomas serves as the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy in the United States Coast Guard. In this role, Admiral Thomas oversees 3 Coast Guard directorates: inspections and compliance, marine transportation systems, and commercial regulations and standards. In addition to his assignment at the Coast Guard headquarters here in Washington, Admiral Thomas has also served in San Francisco, Port Canaveral, Florida, and Galveston, Texas. Mr. Gregory Wilshosen is the Director of Information Security Issues at GAO, where he leads cybersecurity and privacy-related studies and audits of the federal government and critical infrastructure. He has over 30 years of auditing, financial management, and information systems experience, having served at the Department of Education before joining the GAO in 1997. Mr. Randy Parsons is the Director of Security Services for the Port of Long Beach, California, the nation's second busiest seaport, a position that he's held since the fall of 2012. Mr. Parsons oversees more than 80 security personnel, including harbor patrol officers, and he directs a Homeland Security program for the 3,000-acre port complex, including 24-hour patrols, anti-terrorism programs, and security coverage. He has a long history of public service, includes time with the FBI and the TSA. Mr. Jonathan Sawicki is the Security Improvement Program Manager for the ports of Brownsville and Harlingen, Texas, where since 2008 he has assisted in the development of port-wide security strategic risk management plans, including a TWIC card reader deployment program at the Port of Brownsville. So their full written statements will appear in the record, and the Chair now recognizes Admiral Thomas for his testimony. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good morning, and good morning to distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for your continued strong support of the Coast Guard and for this opportunity to talk about the very important, relevant, and timely topic of cyber in the maritime sector. Madam Chairman, if I may, before we begin this morning, join you in offering, on behalf of all the men and women of the Coast Guard, our deepest condolences to the families of the 33 souls that were lost aboard El Faro last week. As mariners and maritime professionals, we know only too well the perils that all those who serve our nation at sea face, and we felt the loss of El Faro very deeply. Madam Chair, as already been mentioned, the Coast Guard recently released our cyber strategy. That strategy recognizes that cyber does not represent a new mission for the Coast Guard, but is in fact a domain in which we must be able to operate effectively in order to conduct all of our missions, including our response and our prevention missions. In that sense, the Coast Guard authorities, responsibilities, roles, and missions naturally extend into cyberspace. The cyber strategy identifies 3 priorities for our service: defending our own cyberspace, enabling Coast Guard operations, and protecting critical maritime infrastructure. It's this 3rd priority that falls within my purview in the Coast Guard, and which I understand is of most interest to this committee today. The Coast Guard is really well suited to take a leadership role in addressing cyber risks to the maritime critical infrastructure as part of the larger interagency effort led by the Department of Homeland Security and in conjunction with maritime stakeholders. The Coast Guard, as has already been mentioned, has a long history of working with port partners across the interagency to mitigate safety, security, and environmental risks to U.S. ports, and we will take the same approach in the cyber domain. The Coast Guard is the sector-specific agency for maritime transportation under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, and whether the initiating event occurs in cyberspace or in a physical domain, the Coast Guard already has broad authority and responsibility under the Maritime Transportation Security Act to prevent transportation security and incidents. We have similar authority and responsibility under a number of statutes to prevent accidents and incidents that may damage people, property, or the environment. And we have an existing regulatory structure that requires regulated industry to assess safety, security, and environmental risks and to address those risks. The Coast Guard has already undertaken significant effort within the interagency, industry, academia, and with our international partners to assess and understand cyber risk in the maritime transportation system. In the course of this work, we have leveraged the expertise that exists at the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, and many others. Our ultimate goal is to incorporate cyber risk management into the existing safety and security regimes that have served the maritime industry and the American public so well for so long. Of course, in doing so, we will remain focused, as we always have, on risk-based performance standards that provide flexible, layered protection against cyber risks while allowing the benefits of cyber-enabled operations in the MTS. There's no doubt, it's been mentioned, cyber capabilities that make our transportation systems more effective, efficient, productive, and environmentally friendly also introduce operational risk that now has to be managed effectively. We have already seen incidents in the maritime transportation system that have resulted in physical consequences or significant near misses. In some cases, it would appear that these were intentional actions, perhaps by actors with malicious intent, but in other cases, they were clearly accidents caused by improper use or maintenance of cyber systems. That is why cyber is both a safety and a security issue, and that's why the Coast Guard is holistically addressing cyber risk management as just that, a risk management challenge. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and to further discussion.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Will Shoson for his testimony.
Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Villa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today at today's hearing on cybersecurity risks facing our nation's maritime facilities. As you know, maritime ports are an essential part of the United States transportation critical infrastructure and handle more than $1.3 trillion of cargo each year. A major disruption in the maritime transportation system could have a significant impact on global shipping, international trade, and our national economy. Today, I will summarize GAO's report on maritime port cybersecurity that we issued back in June 2014. The report addressed cyber-related threats facing our nation's ports and steps the U.S. Coast Guard and other stakeholders had taken to address cyber risks. But before I begin, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would like to recognize several teammates who are instrumental in developing my statement and conducting the work underpinning it. Mike Gilmore, who is with me today, is an assistant director and led this engagement, along with Brad Becker and Kush Malhotra. Lee McCracken, Jennifer Bryant, and Scott Pettis also made significant contributions to this effort. Thank you. Madam Chairman, our nation and its ports face an evolving array of cyber-based threats. The increasing dependence of port activities on computerized information and communication systems to manage the movement of cargo makes them vulnerable to many of the same threats facing other cyber-reliant critical infrastructure. These threats include both targeted and untargeted exploits from a variety of sources, including criminal groups, nation-states, and state-sponsored entities, and disgruntled insiders. By exploiting vulnerabilities in information and communication technology supporting port operations, cyber adversaries can potentially disrupt the flow of commerce, endanger public safety, and facilitate the theft of valuable cargo. In June 2014, we reported that the Coast Guard and other stakeholders had taken limited steps to address cybersecurity at selected ports. Specifically, the Coast Guard had not included cyber-related risk in its 2012 biennial assessment of risk to the maritime environment. Maritime security plans required by law and regulation generally contained very limited information on cyber threats and vulnerabilities because the guidance issued by the Coast Guard did not require cyber elements to be addressed. In addition, the Coast Guard helped to establish information sharing mechanisms, but one of them, a Maritime Sector Coordinating Council, comprised of private sector stakeholders, disbanded in 2011, eliminating a national level forum for sharing and coordinating information on port security. We also reported that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, identified enhancing cybersecurity capabilities as a priority for its port security grant program. However, its grant review process was not informed by Coast Guard cybersecurity expertise, thereby increasing the risk that the grants were allocated to projects or were not allocated to projects that would effectively enhance port security. In our 2014 report, we recommended that the Coast Guard include cyber risks in its updated risk assessment for the maritime environment, address cyber risk in its guidance for maritime security plans, and consider reestablishing the Sector Coordinating Council. We also recommended that FEMA ensure funding decisions for its Port Security Grant Program, are informed by cybersecurity expertise and a comprehensive risk assessment. DHS concurred with our recommendations, and since our report was issued in 2014, the Coast Guard and FEMA have taken actions to partially implement 2 of our recommendations. In summary, protecting our maritime ports from cyber-based threats is of increasing importance. While the Coast Guard and FEMA have taken steps, more needs to be done to ensure that the federal and non-federal stakeholders are working together effectively to mitigate these threats. Fully implementing our recommendations will help the Coast Guard and FEMA to achieve this. Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Villa, and members of the committee, this concludes my opening statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Parsons. And again, sir, we appreciate you traveling from California to join us today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some information, excuse me, this morning from an operations perspective. As you mentioned, the Port of Long Beach is the 2nd busiest seaport in the United States. Combined with our neighbor adjacent, the Port of Los Angeles, we've handled over 15 million cargo containers in 2014, and that represents over 40% of the imparted cargo to the United States. Partly in effort to protect the diverse and large environment that we have, we operate the Joint Command and Control Center, which is a 24/7 operation that provides domain awareness to all of our partners, government and private sector, and is the hub for critical incident management. The Coordination Center houses over $100 million in technical security assets. But we know that port authorities aren't the only target and possibly not the primary target for cybersecurity threats. Private sector business entities such as the terminal operators control a substantial portion of the economic movement through our ports. The potential perpetrators and the threats, as you mentioned and as the Admiral alluded to, aren't very unique to the maritime environment. We have threats to the port that are a danger to humans as well as catastrophic economic damage. We have workers, we have visitors, we have where both ports are housed in a densely populated metropolitan area. Taken into account the dangerous nature of the persons, and Port of Long Beach supports 30,000 jobs in the immediate area and 1.4 million jobs nationwide. An impact to a complex the size of Long Beach and LA could impact our national well-being. There are a number of challenges that we face in the maritime environment for cybersecurity. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution for all ports. The business models for ports vary based on the size of the ports, the nature of the business that goes through the ports, and frankly, how they're governed. Long Beach is a landlord port. We have very little input into the security posture of our tenants. Other ports are operators of ports and are better postured to make recommendations and requirements. A challenge is a lack of awareness about our own systems. Sometimes systems are a patchwork of legacy systems. They're often operated or administered by folks with different purposes and a myopic focus on their required specific functions, and this creates a lack of enterprise perspective or awareness for the cybersecurity problem. There is a notable reluctance to share information about cybersecurity issues. To acknowledge a cybersecurity event could potentially mean a loss of business reputation and public trust. Much of the information for maritime stakeholders is deemed as proprietary, to the degree that dissemination could create business disadvantage. There is a need to clearly identify roles and responsibilities of the various government agencies involved in cybersecurity. The ports of Long Beach and LA have been contacted and have worked with the United States Coast Guard, the FBI, Secret Service, and multiple entities of the Department of Homeland Security. We've tried to use incentives at our port to generate buy-in, and we've done that successfully with our Green Port program and our Clean Truck policy. FEMA has incentivized to a degree cybersecurity matters by emphasizing cybersecurity mitigation and vulnerability assessments in the recent grant year. We agree that subject matter experts need to have continued input into those grant awards. The spending has increased as a result of that, but it's imperative that FEMA maintain a focus on strategic thought and the current and developing regulations. We support the efforts of the Coast Guard in their expanded mission to enhance security, but we realize that's created a specialized mission requirement that requires additional funding. We believe that protecting U.S. ports must be a core capability of our nation. We realize, as everyone does, we cannot stop all attacks, but focusing on the development of strategic policies and guidelines is sorely needed. A roadmap that provides guidance but flexibility for industry decisions makes sense and will strengthen our national security, cybersecurity posture. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sawicki, and again, we appreciate you traveling from Texas to join with us, sir.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, and members of the audience, my name is John Sawicki, and I was asked to testify today based upon experience gained while serving as a Security Improvement Program Manager for the ports of Brownsville and Harlingen, Texas. I'm humbled and honored to be here today to share with you this experience, as well as my own opinions on the status of cybersecurity in our port communities. Today, I would like to focus on the importance of risk-based strategic planning and how cyber risk is a critical component within that approach. I'd like to share with the committee information on recent efforts to manage cyber risk in the maritime domain, and will provide brief comments on the Coast Guard's cybersecurity strategy, as well as provide some general recommendations for consideration. My hope today is that once we all leave here, the members of the subcommittee, the audience, and my fellow witnesses are better equipped to make informed risk-based decisions when implementing cybersecurity and resiliency strategies. The bombing of the U.S.'s Cole and September 11th attacks on our country made it clear that we had to increase our level of homeland security nationwide. Just as how we travel by air has changed, the way we conduct maritime commerce has also changed. We need to understand, we all know that there are capable and motivated threats out there for cyber and for physical security, and we must implement risk-based strategies. To mitigate against some of these physical security threats, in 2002, the Port of Brownsville established a sworn police department responsible for not only enforcing laws and providing public safety, but for implementing programs and measures to protect port infrastructure and maintain compliance with the MTSA. In 2007, the port conducted a comprehensive threat assessment, which was closely followed by a port-wide strategic risk management plan in 2008. While not required of the Port of Brownsville, this plan has been a critical component to our success with the Port Security Grant Program, securing over $14 million in funds for physical security enhancement projects. Currently, the port is in the process of updating this initial port-wide strategic risk management plan with an additional focus on industrial hazards and cybersecurity. A strategic risk-based approach to managing the threats and hazards at the Port of Brownsville has resulted in a safer and more secure environment within commerce, or within which commerce can be conducted. So cybersecurity at the Port of Brownsville. Using the NIST cybersecurity framework as a guide, the Port of Brownsville recently conducted a cybersecurity assessment to identify critical systems, evaluate current cybersecurity posture, establish a target state for cybersecurity, and identify and prioritize opportunities for improvement. The timing of this assessment was optimal, as the port had recently hired its first IT manager and was in the process of performing significant upgrades to existing communication systems, port management systems, and general operating systems. The result of this cybersecurity assessment indicated opportunities for improvement in all 5 cybersecurity functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Using the results of this assessment, the port prepared and submitted a grant application through the fiscal year 2015 Port Security Grant Program. Unfortunately, the project was not funded. Even though it was not funded, the port strives to improve our cybersecurity posture, and even though at a slower pace, is doing so. So comments on the U.S. Coast Guard strategy. In general, I support the U.S. Coast Guard's vision for operating in the cyber domain and the 3 primary priorities of defending cyberspace, enabling operations, and protecting infrastructure critical to the MTS. The risk-based decision-making model utilized in the overall strategy and strategy development and proposed implementation will be very beneficial, and I believe that the stated goals and objectives are reasonably achievable given support and resources on an ongoing and consistent manner. And I think that ongoing and consistency is very important. The most important goal stated in the strategy in terms of port-wide risk management, in my mind, is to increase operational resiliency by ensuring mission-focused cyberspace operations and incorporating cybersecurity into U.S. Coast Guard culture. This focus on resiliency and the concept of establishing a culture of cybersecurity is key to managing risk posed by a persistent and capable threat. This operational resiliency will effectively reduce the consequence associated of a potential cyber-based transportation security incident and work to gain buy-in from port area partners and other maritime domain stakeholders. Ultimately, to adequately address the cyber risk, we must all work to establish and nourish a culture of enhanced cybersecurity and vigilance within our own organizations. You have many of my recommendations in my written testimony, so I'm not going to go through all those today. But most importantly, I feel we need to continue to support at the port level and the national level risk-based decision-making and the plans that, or the assessments required to do so. So I leave you today with thanking you for this opportunity. General Douglas MacArthur is credited with saying there's no security on this earth, only opportunity. And I feel right now we have that opportunity to help build cybersecurity throughout the MTS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you gentlemen. And I think what I'll do is just ask a more global question and ask each one of you to respond to it. And I will preface it by telling you the reason I called this hearing, it's obviously, I mean, if you talk to anybody at the Pentagon and you ask them what keeps you awake at night, they'll tell you a cyber attack. That's what they're worried about as much as anything else of all the threats that we face. And when you talk to members on the Intel Committee, you know, they'll tell you about some of the things that are happening. I mean, we see some of the things openly reported of these hackers, like the OPM kind of thing that happened here in the government domain recently, where you had the hackers sitting there probably in the information environment for could have been a year. You know, we were, as members of Congress, we were talking about whether or not we ought to get credit security agencies available to all of these folks that had their had been hacked in. But look, they weren't looking for somebody's credit card information, probably. But anyway, and the other hat that I wear, besides sitting on the Homeland Security Committee, I'm also the chair of the House Administration Committee, where we are concerned about cyber for the campus here. And I won't go into some of the issues that we've had there, but, you know, obviously we're a target, right? So you can imagine. But at any rate, as I sort of think about this whole area of cybersecurity in the port, in the maritime environment, and I think about the Coast Guard being missioned with this, and Admiral Thomas, I would also say that, you know, I also have a saying that I always say, if it's wet and impossible, send in the Coast Guard, because you guys just handle it. And then, you know, since 9/11, all we've done is load you up, with so many other kinds of missions. So, and now you're tasked with this as well, with cybersecurity. But, you know, the world's a changing, evolving threat environment all the time. It's much more asymmetrical than it has ever been in the past. And as evidenced by the kinds of things and worries that the fellows at the ports are having. I guess just generically my question is, how do you think the Coast Guard is doing with this mission? And to the rest of you, and nothing against the Coast Guard, but do you think the Coast Guard is the proper agency, and do they have adequate resources, again, to carry out another mission that the government has tasked them with? And, you know, our committee, we need to hear from all of you of what kinds of situations you're having out there. And then it's up for us to finance to the best extent that we can and prioritize the government's money here of doing the kinds of things that we need to be able to do to make sure that the missions that we give the brave men and women in the Coast Guard and every other agency is adequate for that. So I guess that's sort of generally, I'm just trying to understand whether or not the Coast Guard is the kinds of challenges that you find yourself with, and what the rest of you think about how that's going, and what perhaps we could do differently, if necessary. Admiral?
Well, thank you for that great question. I, in my statement, mentioned that we don't view this as a new mission. We view it as a natural extension of our existing mission. So maybe I can elaborate on that. You know, when the maritime industry shifted from sail to steam, the Coast Guard had to develop standards and the ability to ensure compliance with those standards for boilers and for engineers for the first time. And then when we shifted from steam to internal combustion and from internal combustion to major electrical power. So the industry has moved to operating in cyber, and the Coast Guard has got to move with them. So it's the natural extension of our mission given to us by Congress to manage operational risk in the maritime area. Now, that said, it's a different type of risk that we have to manage. And so we need to develop different expertise, and we need to bring some different capabilities. We're doing that by leveraging the expertise and capabilities that exist across the government and by building our own workforce. One of the reasons why our Commandant insisted that we have a cyber strategy is so that our entire organization stays focused on those things that we know we need to do in order to be operationally effective across all of our missions in the 21st century operating environment. And you know, that includes building the workforce. It includes, you know, developing the proper kind of standards. So again, I don't see this as a new mission. We see it as a new domain in which we need to conduct all of our missions. Certainly when I talk to the industry about how do we manage the risks introduced by cyber systems, and we talk about how we manage other risks that are, you know, always been out there, the same types of approaches, the same risk-based performance standards, the same type of regulatory regime is what people tell me they think will work. So thank you for the question.
Mr. Wilcherson?
Yes, I would just like to add, too, that it's good to hear Admiral Thomas talk about leveraging other resources across the federal government, because there are several that can help in, as the Coast Guard tries to bring up in their cybersecurity capabilities. Even within its own department, of the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications has a number of groups that are skilled in cybersecurity-related matters, and that certainly can help inform the Coast Guard's effort. In addition, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has developed a framework, a cybersecurity framework for improving cybersecurity within the critical infrastructure. And that, too, is another framework that can help inform the Coast Guard's efforts, and indeed all of the maritime sector's efforts to improve the cybersecurity. So there are other resources available that can help the Coast Guard in performing those activities.
Mr. Parsons, what is your thought?
Madam Chair, I don't think there's any question the Coast Guard is the right agency. The Coast Guard and their captains of the port are perfectly positioned to lead strategy and guidelines for port security measures. As the Admiral says, that's what they've done all along. They're the right people. Clearly, something this large and complex, there's going to be a maturational process to this, and I feel like we are at the beginning of it. But the things that I feel we need in the maritime environment are leadership, coordination, a strategy, create a fabric for all the working entities in the port, not just port authorities, but for the business entities in the port. Quite frankly, we struggle as a landlord port to have much say in the position of security in our tenants. You mentioned the fully automated port. Once implemented, or terminal, I'm sorry, fully automated terminal. Once fully operative, that will handle 3 million cargo containers a year. That number, which is expected to be fulfilled through contracts, would make that one terminal the fourth largest port in the United States. We have very little input into their, we can inquire, we can discuss it, we can confer and can collaborate, but we have no guidelines or standards that could help them motivate. I'm sure they have a very robust cybersecurity program for a fully automated terminal, but we don't have any insight into that and no real insight in how to get there. The last thing I would say is many of the challenges I mentioned, again, the Coast Guard, I think, is postured for systems awareness, threat awareness, training programs. They're kind of a mishmash if they exist. Our concern is the level of resources that they have to do this job and how long it would take to do it. If there were a national a national vulnerability assessment, a charge for all ports, that's going to be a beefy undertaking. It's going to take a long time. But again, with their experience at understanding the difference between the different nature of the ports, I think the captains of the port are, again, the best postured to take something like that on.
Mr. Sawicki?
Thank you very much. In my opinion, for the current operations, yes, the Coast Guard has resources to continue to facilitate the conversation. I think that's the most important part right now, is that within ports, we have many experts at many private terminals, but it's very difficult to get them all into one room to share their own strategies because they all compete. So I think at this point, the Coast Guard is doing an incredible role through area maritime security committees, through port safety committees, to facilitate that conversation and to better understand what private industry is doing, some of their concerns. The primary concern that I see with information sharing, specifically with port tenants, is the possibility for reputational impact of a private company if they share a cyber breach. So I think currently, by facilitating these conversations, by working with private industry and working within existing regulations, I believe the Coast Guard is the right organization for this role. And I believe it'll take us a while to get there, but this is a very big problem, but we're still in the proactive stage. Fortunately, we're not in the reactive stage. So, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. And before I recognize the ranking member, I'd also like to recognize and ask you see that the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe, who's the chairman of the committee's subcommittee on cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and security technologies, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing, and without objection. So ordered. Mr. Vela.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Parsons, you hit on 2 points that I'd like to basically hear about, and in a broader context of not just cybersecurity, but port security in general. And the first is with respect to communication between ports, for example, in California, Port of San Diego, Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and many others. And Texas, it would be Port of Brownsville, Port of Corpus Christi, Galveston, Houston. What kind of information sharing systems do we have in place between all these different ports?
In our area, we have, the first thing and the best thing is we know each other. We spend a lot of time together in other emergency management and crisis situations. We attend the same conferences. We are part of the same cybersecurity working groups that cover both ports. We share information. I tell you, a bright spot in information sharing is the FBI's Cyberhood Watch program. So that is one place where port entities, and importantly, private entity terminals, have agreed to input their defense information as they defend against cyber attacks into the FBI's Cyberhood Watch. The FBI analyzes that information, and one thing we really appreciate is it's a two-way flow of information. They provide information back to the stakeholders if they see a pattern or a trend that needs tending, and that goes to all stakeholders. So some of that proprietary influence has been broken down with Cyberhood Watch.
Mr. Sawicki.
I agree, and would also reinforce that through the FBI's InfraGuard program as well. That's where a lot of industry information sharing takes place. Port-wise, you're looking at conferences, AAPA events, seminars where the same groups get together, discuss issues they're sharing, but I'm not aware of any formal communication platform between ports to share. Now, if there is an issue, someone receives a breach, then information sharing takes place through the National Response Center. I have not seen that process take place, so I'm not sure how reactive it can be. But currently, area maritime security committees, existing meetings, the conversations are happening. Everyone is talking about it. But as far as a formal platform, I'm not aware of one.
So would the common thread from coast to coast be the FBI Cyber Watch program? Or is that what you called it?
There's multiple programs under and I believe under the InfraGard program, which is, you know, I'm a member, I sign up, very quick background checks, and then I receive, you know, emails on specific threats that are, you know, out there. Most of these are, you know, non-classified, but sensitive, I guess would be the way to put it. So there is information in industry, and then when industry partners talk to non-maritime, like NERC, for example, some of the other regulatory boards, there's a lot of information out there, but it's more informal than formally received.
Mr. Parsons, the other point I wanted to hit on is you mentioned the challenge in getting the tenants to share information. Is that something that we see across the nation?
Yeah, it's one of those things I don't think is unique to the maritime environment, and it's a valid concern. One thing I think the Cyberhood Watch program has done is called the private sector tenants together, made the point, we understand your position, we've seen it happen in the United States, but on balance, with a port complex such as Long Beach and Los Angeles, we do have to balance proprietary interests with potential damage to national security. That argument and possibly others have drawn these private sector people into Cyberhood Watch. That's a huge step. There's been a lack of trust, a parochial interest in their information. That's been a tough pull, but this is a glimmer of success that we've seen.
Mr. Wilson, what are your thoughts on the 2015 Coast Guard cyber strategy?
I think it's a step forward to recognize and identifying the 3 objectives that they've laid out in their strategy, particularly with protecting the critical infrastructure in the maritime environment, which was the focus of our report and the actions being done there. So to that extent, I think it's been a positive step and something that, of course, I understand will be guiding their efforts going forward. But one thing I would just like to also point out regarding the information sharing issue that's been discussed is that there have been a number of barriers to effective information security, and Mr. Parsons and Mr. Sawicki touched on a couple of those. One is establishing those relationships and how important it is to establish trust in order for private sector companies to share their information with the government or among themselves. The other thing is part of that, what could happen to facilitate that sharing of information is to have a secure mechanism in which organizations can provide that information to the government, and conversely, federal agencies can provide actionable threat, alert, and incident information back to the private sector. There should also be capabilities to anonymize the information, so the issue with regard to reputational impairment, if you will, on the part of a private sector who reports an incident at its site, at least it can be anonymized so the individual entity is not being identified. But the information about the threat, about the incident, and it will be something that can be shared across the sector. So there are a couple actions that can be taken to help improve information sharing across the board.
Well, thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for allowing me and Radcliffe to intrude on your hearing. First of all, gentlemen, thank you for what you do for our country, your interest in protecting our national security. I have 2 reasons why I asked the chairwoman and the ranking member if I could join you today. One is we have a great love for the Coasties. I come from New York, and when Governor's Island closed, the Coasties came to Staten Island, where I live. And we are very proud, we're very grateful for their work, and we're so honored that they decided to come to Staten Island. The other is my dad was a longshoreman for 40 years. And before containerization, longshoremen would go down into the hull of a ship with a hook and grab a burlap sack of coffee beans and walk it out of the hull of the ship. And my father used to come home with the coffee beans, the loose ones in his cuffs of his pants. We used to grind them up and we had coffee. But you know, the security back then, I suspect they had dogs that would sniff the cargo, maybe some detectives for radiological materials on some of the ships. But your mission has become so great. And when you spoke, Admiral, about, you know, you guys remind me of Larry the Cable Guy. You're just going to get it done. no matter what it is. But your resources are finite. And to take on this other mission or expanding the mission that you already have in the security of our ports is going to cost you resources. Are other parts of the Coast Guard's missions going to suffer because now you have to direct resources to this new threat that we face now in cybersecurity?
Well, thanks for your support of the Coast Guard, and we love Staten Island as well. You know, I would say of the three objectives in our Coast Guard cyber strategy, the least resource intensive is the one around our role for protecting maritime critical infrastructure. And that is because of some points that have already been made. That infrastructure is privately owned. The real responsibility to do the defense of those systems is with the private sector. So we don't envision Coast Guard personnel, for example, actively defending private sector systems. Our role in that regard is to set a reasonable performance standard and then have the people in place to ensure that standard is met. That might involve the use of third parties, and in fact, I'm quite certain that it would. We use third parties across our compliance program. So do we need additional resources to do that? Yes. Is the demand as large as you might think? Probably not, at least not for that component of our strategy, because again, we will leverage the capabilities across the government, both in terms of setting the standards, and one of the reasons that we don't have the assessments in place that the GAO would like to see is because we want to make sure we use the same assessment tools that are used in other sectors, and they're just not there yet, so it would make no sense to move out ahead of that. But we'll leverage all those resources. Yes, there will be a resource bill, will impact our other missions. Our Coast Guard Commandant has been pretty clear that cyber is a way to make sure we do our missions better and more effectively. It's not a mission to detract from others.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, I waive the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The lady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And once again, always a pleasure to serve with you on this subcommittee. As you know, I probably live about 25 minutes away from the Port of Long Beach and maybe half an hour away from the Port of Los Angeles. And almost 50% of our goods, I think, come through those two ports to the United States. Port of Long Beach alone handles about $150 billion in trade annually. And of course, we're talking about a lot of Southern California jobs between these two ports. So I would like to ask Mr. Parsons, what would be the impact of a significant cyber attack on your port? What do you envision would be, on the high end, something that would just cripple what is going on? And how long do you think, given the current infrastructure, it would take to get things back to normal?
Thank you, Congressman. We're always very concerned about major attacks, but I tell you, we've experienced plenty of small ones that have given us some insight into what happens in port environments. Those have been generated by some by labor action and slowdowns, some by malfunctioning of systems, not only within ports but on a larger scale within the city of Long Beach.
But with the automation, and I know the automation, I understand the whole issue of much of this infrastructure is owned by these individual maritime companies, et cetera. But give me an example of something that you think would be just incredibly crippling and what we could imagine would be the after effect. I'm thinking from an economy standpoint in particular for California.
Well, we could go back to 2002 and the work stoppage there, where the national economy was dramatically affected, and depending on whose figures you believe.
Was that like 8 days or 18 days or something?
Exactly, and in 2002 dollars, it was a loss of $1 billion a day to the national economy. So we can assume it's gone up from there. What we've seen is systems shut down. As Mr. Sawicki talked about, resiliency and redundancy is a huge part of cybersecurity. How quickly can we spin back up? And what we've seen is a lack of redundancy and acceptable backup systems. in some cases as simple as power backup. Some of the terminals during the problems we had with the electrical grid out there, they were down. The irony was the security systems are up and running, we're backed up, but the economy isn't moving. So that's a great concern to us. And again, it goes back to the awareness of the systems. Exactly how long would it take these individual
Right.
terminals to come back on?
I remember it was, even after we solved the issue, it was a long time in getting the backup and getting everything back to normal and getting the ships out. And of course, much of that was perishable to some extent, et cetera. So it was a big economic crunch. I'm very confident in my Coast Guard. I've visited a lot, both up in the San Francisco Bay Area, of course, in our ports, and in San Diego, with respect to your ability, your ability to cover and to have consistent knowledge of each port within the Coast Guard. So I want to congratulate you on that, actually, because I think you're doing a good job with respect to that. But I think this whole issue, Madam Chair, going back to this issue of, and we've seen this over and over in other areas, whether it's petrochemical or anything else, that the mainstay of the infrastructure is in individuals' hands, right, in private hands. And so what is our role, and how do we ensure that, in fact, even in an economic situation, there is backup energy generation, for example? So I know that you've all talked about, we need more communication, or we need to know more. How do we do that? How do we, if we, the government, wanted to somehow take the initiative to actually get this going, what would that look like? What could we do, given that everybody's individual stakeholders have proprietary information, they want to, but they don't want to come together and figure out how we are better protected against cyber, seeming that Homeland Security is supposed to be in charge of everything but defense cyber in our agencies, and that we are somehow supposed to help private entities who are so important to us get this act together with us. What would you suggest? If I told you tomorrow, fix this problem and let's get this done, what would that look like to any of you who are on the panel? Give us some ideas of what we can do as a committee to help you get that done.
It's a very good question, a very difficult question, but I think initially is to focus on those systems that facilitate commerce. The navigation systems. After a hurricane, as an example, you can have every facility ready to operate, but if that channel isn't open, then it really doesn't matter. So I would say focus on the major navigation systems, the federal systems, ensure private entities trust in those systems, and then help facilitate conversations among private industry, because I believe private industry is going to do on their own to protect their own interest. So I think that magic bullet is to focus internally first while everyone else tries to get a handle on the situation on their own, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Congressman, as a government and a committee, I think it has a lot to do with what we talked about today, supporting the Coast Guard to create this fabric, identify systems through risk-based assessments, identify the priority gaps. But I think there's got to be some regulation. It can be voluntary, as it has been in the past, to be honest with you. Left to our own devices, we don't seem to have done very well. So the other thing I mentioned is the Port of Long Beach has used incentives for our private entity partners to engage in various programs that we've had there. But you may evolve to regulations and even requirements, authorities that have been given to the Coast Guard in some other areas. But we have to generate whatever motivation it's gonna take to get this done. And the reason this is going to be a maturational process is there's not one size that fits all with ports, so there's got to be a recognition that it's a different playing field in different ports.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, and I agree. If you've seen one port, you've seen one port. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Vella, again, for the opportunity to be part of your subcommittee today and for holding this hearing on a critically important topic. On the cybersecurity subcommittee, where I also serve, we talk a lot about cybersecurity threats to our power grids and to our nuclear missile silos and other critical infrastructure, but we frankly talk a lot less about the fact that 90% of the world's consumer goods are shipped on boats and vessels that come through our ports, and that statistic alone really underscores the gravity of the threat that we're talking about here. If the maritime industry suffered a major cyber attack, it could leave grocery store shelves empty. It could leave gas tanks at filling stations across the country empty, and obviously that have a devastating, tremendous impact on our economy. And so, and to that point, I want to ask about a report that was in the news last year, and maybe Admiral Thomas, you maybe want to start with. I read a report that a U.S. port had suffered a 7-hour interruption of a GPS signal. Can you confirm that for me?
Yes, I mean, there's a container terminal that is fully automated that relies on GPS signal in order to locate specific containers and move cranes around. That particular disruption, if we're thinking about the same one, was ultimately determined not to be related to an intentional attack, but it does highlight the vulnerabilities associated with particularly relying on one system for that type of an operation.
Terrific. So given the challenges that the Department of Homeland Security and the federal government, as I think well known, is having in this arena with respect to the ability to retain a talented and keep a talented cyber workforce, I'd like to get your perspective. There's been some discussion earlier about leveraging other resources, and within the department, there is the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. Is that a resource that you've been able to leverage? And if not, why not? Because a lot of what we've been talking about at the Homeland Security Committee generally is trying to elevate the NCIC and its role and its use as a resource in this regard.
Well, I think you'll be happy to hear that NCIC is absolutely a resource for us, and it's a resource that impacts all three of our strategic priorities in our cyber strategy. We have a Coast Guard person there full-time. It's one of the ways we're building our own expertise, but it also ensures that the NCIC is fully linked up with our Coast Guard Cybersecurity Operations Center. We're sharing information on a daily basis. We're taking information in from the industry, and we are providing information dozens and dozens of times a year to the industry on cyber threats, particularly in the maritime sector. So NCIC is every day getting more and more effective and getting more well-known, and I think achieving their mission.
Well, good. I'm actually very pleased to hear that. And so, in follow-up to that, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Parsons, because you talked a little bit about the information sharing aspect, and obviously that's one of the things that the NCIC tries to accomplish. Has that been a resource for you? And if not, why not?
In the Port of Long Beach, we have two cyber functions. We have two completely separate networks. On the security side of the house, that's a reliance we have on the enterprise information management group. They have, for the last 3 years, had staffing, particularly as cybersecurity experts, and we look to them to share that information on an enterprise level. With our standalone network, we share with various federal databases. Both networks personnel meet and talk with each other. Both the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach have SOCs, Cybersecurity Operations Center. The City of Los Angeles Mayor's Office stood up a a robust cyber fusion center for the region, and both ports have connectivity with that. I think part of the point you're trying to get to, though, is to me, there's a lot of sharing going on, but I think there may need some better leadership and direction to make sure the right information's getting to the right people.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Wilshusen, a follow-up, because you actually, broached this subject and talked about some of the barriers to information sharing, but I assume that you're familiar with the bill that we moved through this committee and then successfully through the House, the National Cybersecurity Protection Advancement Act, that is an information sharing bill and does provide for, or intends to provide for, if passed into law, the opportunity to scrub out the type of information that has discouraged sharing personal identifying information, proprietary information, and to limit it to cyber threat indicators. Any perspectives on that legislation, and was that what you were addressing?
Well, I think, to the extent that that legislation will improve the sharing of information on cyber threats, incidents among the various different sectors and in the federal agencies, it's going to be a positive. And indeed, we're also we've been mandated, GAO has been mandated to look at the NCIC and how well it's implementing its mission, roles, and responsibilities in helping to facilitate the sharing of information.
Appreciate y'all being here today, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to be on the subcommittee. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Thank you both for attending. We appreciate it. Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Chairman, I ask unanimous consent for the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, to sit and question the witness at today's hearing.
Without objection, the chair now recognizes Mr. Langevin,
Thank you,
gentleman
Madam
from Rhode
Chair.
Island, a former Secretary of State, as was myself.
Likewise, you bet. Well, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Sawicki and Ms. Parsons, if I could just start with you. Mr. Sawicki, one thing that caught my eye in your written testimony was your recommendation that DHS, and I quote, further define and provide guidance on what constitutes a transportation security incident specific to potential or actual cyber breaches. Can you and Mr. Parsons expand on this a bit further? And what, if any, guidance have you received?
Sure, and thank you very much for the question. My recommendation is, the focus of it is to help understand that just because a facility is in a port and on the water, every security incident doesn't always elevate beyond the fence line to where it impacts the maritime transportation system. So I think it's important that we all come up with whatever that line is, to where it's purely a internal crime versus something that needs to be reported through NRC and responded to by the federal government. I am not aware of any specific guidance on what constitutes a transportation security incident based on cyber. And I think in the majority of facility security plans or port facility security plans, there's always a question on what is a breach, what is a potential breach, and what is a near miss. And so I think helping define that will help port facilities and ports report incidents that do occur.
Okay. So can I ask you this? How do you report cybersecurity incidents to the federal government, and to whom have you reported?
I think that's the question. Right now, we have not reported any cybersecurity incidents because we have not had any that I'm aware of that are significant enough to report. I think one thing to understand specifically for the Port of Brownsville and many other mid-tier ports, that our focus right now is not so much protecting our networks through additional measures. It's upgrading aging systems, so upgrading software, hardware that comes with the basic protections versus adding additional protections. So right now, if we were to have a breach to the port's cyber, to their internal email network, I think it would take some conversation to see who needs to be reported.
Okay. So let me take a different tack a bit. What incidents do you report, and what are the criteria you use to determine whether to report?
Right now, our incidents that we report are breaches of security based on our facility security plan. So somebody who may jump a fence, be seen jumping the fence, kind of breaks our perimeter, the basic intrusion. If there is a threat that's reported, we'll report that. But right now, most of the reporting is done in accordance with our security plan and is based on an actual breach of our physical security.
So right now, no criteria for reporting any type of a cyber event or intrusion?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Parsons, if I could, in your testimony, you mentioned that ports can be reluctant to reveal they've been breached. Are there requirements as to what you must report?
No, sir. In the same vein about reporting, there is some confusion about what's reported to who. Our information management division tells us we defend against approximately 1 million potential penetrations a day. That information is fed to the FBI's Cyberhood Watch Center. So they receive that information and they analyze it with other reporting. Should a major incident occur in the port complex, what we would do isn't any different than any other potential emergency situation. We'd call the Coast Guard, we'd call the FBI, we'd call our partners, and we'd say, here's what we've got. Where do you think this fits? Because we have overlapping jurisdiction within maritime environments. So we work it out through personal communications and collaboration, but there isn't guidance to direct us.
Thank you, Mr. Parsons. Admiral, if I could turn to you, Admiral Thomas, how does the Coast Guard evaluate risk assessments and security plans with respect to cybersecurity, and have you found common challenges across different ports, and are there any model ports that you could point to in terms of protecting cybersecurity?
Well, thank you for the question. If I could just take up the issue of reporting first. I mean, we do receive reports of cybersecurity breaches in ports. We did receive one just last night, in fact. So there are reporting requirements. The cyber incidents that are related to the physical security requirements are reportable under the MTSA. So for example, if there's a loss of access control to a facility, or a loss of cargo control, or a loss of perimeter control that is associated with a cyber breach, that's a reportable incident. The confusion comes because cyber touches all aspects of a port operation. So if it's a financial system, for example, that's been breached, well, that would not be reportable to the Coast Guard because it's not addressed under our authorities. So I think the industry reps here are absolutely right that it's very confusing to figure out which type of incident gets reported to whom. Now, your question with regard to how do we address cyber risks in the ports, I mentioned earlier, I think before you entered the room, that we are working very closely across the interagency to develop those risk assessment tools so that what we employ in the maritime is consistent with what's employed in the power sector, in the financial sector, et cetera. There are a number of those tools under development, again, led by DHS, and we have piloted those in some of the major ports around the nation. There are definitely ports that have been more proactive, and it would be the ones that you would think about, those that have the larger amounts of really high-risk cargoes. And then there's others who are probably rightly just kind of waiting to see what develops in terms of standards.
Thank you, Admiral. I see my time's expired, but I'd have some follow-up questions, and perhaps if you could respond for the record, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman very much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas.
Madam Chair, could I yield to Mr. Donovan, and I'll go last. I'm still looking at my notes. Thank you.
Mr. Donovan has already had his 5 minutes.
Yeah,
You're the
all
last
right.
one.
Then I cannot yield to Mr. Donovan, as they say. Let me thank Ms. Sevilla and Ms. Miller for this, and I'm always glad to see the Brownsville port here, and acknowledge that Congressman Villa has done an excellent job in this capacity and has provided great leadership on these issues for the state of Texas. Obviously, I'm going to make note of the fact that we have the Houston port, and we have a number of concerns about it. So let me first of all ask Mr. Sawicki, are you aware of the FBI watch, and do you engage, use any federal resources such as the FBI if you think something has occurred with respect to cybersecurity?
Thank you very much. I am aware of the FBI's InfraGard program because I'm a member of it, so I receive emails about current threats that can be sent out to people of my I guess stature would be the best way to put it. So we coordinate the same way we coordinate cyber, just like we coordinate safety and security in our ports. It's Area Maritime Security Committee and subcommittees are our primary method for information sharing and communication. I've also worked in and throughout the Port of Houston and the Houston Ship Channel, and there's this very same way. We have very robust Area Maritime Security Committees, very robust harbor safety committees, and that's where a lot of that information sharing is happening. Do we formally engage in Brownsville with the FBI currently? No, because there hasn't been the need to. We do, the topic does come up during AMSC meetings, but we have not, fortunately, we have not had a breach that would require us to coordinate with the FBI.
What do you think the trepidation is for maritime companies not to share cyber attacks that have occurred?
Competition. Competition and the potential for impact to their brand. We've seen some major breaches at some major companies, and we've seen CEOs lose their jobs. We've seen stock prices impacted. I think cyber is a little different because the likelihood of a cyber attack is as close to 100% as you can get. So I think private industry is protecting themselves because of that likelihood, and they're building crisis management programs around cyber just like they do around environmental issues, things like that. So private industry is working it.
We understand that a decade or so ago, this committee established that over 85% of the infrastructure, which would be subject to many attacks, was in the private sector, and we started to send out messages for them to prepare. But what can the federal government do that you think would be effective in easing the concern of competition and looking more closely at the vast, massive impact that would come from a cyber attack, and particularly at the port?
I think initially, and what's happening right now, is facilitating the conversation, but ultimately it's ensuring that any data that is shared is protected. So protecting your own networks first while private industry works to protect their networks, and then to help to continue funding training programs. Like I said, many ports right now are not the very large, not Port Houston, not LA Long Beach, to where the need is training. We can have all the systems in the world, but if I click the wrong email, it can get right around all of it. So I think facilitating training, continuing to support the Port Security Grant Program, and then really looking at some of the cost mass requirements for cyber projects that could potentially mitigate risk at a national level.
Thank you, Admiral Thomas. I can't see you, but I know by your excellent answers that you are here. Let me have a series of questions with you, albeit briefly, and I thank the chairwoman. As I do that, let me acknowledge the Brownsville port, but then, of course, I have in my jurisdiction the Houston port, which is 25-mile long, complex of diversified public and private facilities, and a few hours away from the Gulf of Mexico, which makes it vulnerable on a number of occasions, a number of points. It's man-made. It has major exports. In 2012, Ship Channel-related businesses contributed 1 million plus jobs and 178 plus 5 billion in statewide economic activity. You heard the gentleman from the Port of Brownsville about competition and what could be done. You see the difference in size of the many ports across America. In terms of the Coast Guard's cybersecurity effort, how does the present structure of sequester impact that? And what answer would you give to the private sector who would be willing to give more information if they could be assured of the lack of a breach? What are the firewalls that we are putting in place or have in place?
Well, thank you for the question. With regard to the impact of sequester on our cyber operations, particularly our efforts to secure the critical infrastructure, I would say it's minimal now because we are still in the assessing and communicating phase in the process of figuring out what are the proper performance standards to put into place. As we move into a phase where we actually have to ensure compliance with those standards, and then I think the resource demands become heavier on us.
And what is your projection for moving up to the next step?
Well, one of the interesting things about the cyber question is that it's not really uniquely maritime, in that what we do in the maritime really needs to be closely aligned with and look a lot like what goes on in other sectors. So I think the government needs to move through this. In other words, I don't think we want to be implementing hard standards in the maritime ahead of many of the other sectors, particularly those sectors that the maritime ports connect with, because you wouldn't want to put in place separate requirements for entities that, you know, my rail is going to have to meet this, my port facilities are going to have to meet that, and my trucking facility something else. So I don't know. I think that the timeline, though, has to be carefully coordinated and considered.
Is that the government's challenge to coordinate the private sector in cybersecurity? Because maybe, Admiral, you might have a best practices idea under the Coast Guard that might be utilized by the railroads and otherwise. I'm trying to see who starts and what would be most helpful to get us into this process as I conclude.
Well, so DHS really has taken the leadership role in coordinating across all the sectors, and the Coast Guard participates in that, as does TSA and all the other sector-specific agencies. So I think the focus on sharing those best practices across sectors, and certain sectors are leading, financial, for example, energy, is definitely in place, and the private sector is very involved in that effort.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, gentlelady.
When the
Appreciate it.
If I
I'm going
might,
to move on here. We have a hard deadline.
I understand. When the gentleman finishes, I just want to put a thank you on the record. So
Certainly.
I'd appreciate.
Recognize the gentleman from Texas now, Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. This question is directed at any one of y'all that want to field it, and I want to pick up on some of the questions that my colleague from Houston has talked about. You know, ports, like many other industries in the world, are moving towards automation, integration, you know, and upgrades to industrial control systems. And, you know, probably the two publicly known cases of physical damage occurring as a result of a cyber attack is Stuxnet, probably being the most well known, and it occurred as a result of cyber attacks against industrial control systems. And y'all have talked about information sharing, but what are some of the unique challenges y'all are dealing with in protecting industrial control systems, and, you know, what are y'all doing specifically in that area? Admiral, maybe, or Mr. Parsons?
Well, I mean, I can talk to you about what I know is going on in some of the higher tech portions of the maritime industry. So, for example, those vessels that are out in the Gulf of Mexico drilling in very, very deep water, relying on dynamic positioning systems and systems that are making decisions faster than people can humanly make them, which enables them to drill, you know, miles down. They really have begun to focus, rightly, I believe, on what I call a layered cyber protection strategy, which starts with individual components, the manufacturers of those components, how those are made, how they're then integrated into the system, and how that system is then integrated on the vessel. But then beyond that, really focusing on the human elements, because this is more than just an IT problem. So also, how are those systems operated, maintained, and how are the operators and maintainers trained? Because very basic training, like don't plug your iPhone into this system, can go a long way to help to prevent. So what I have seen, particularly in those portions of the industry that rely more heavily on high tech, is a risk management approach for cyber that is akin to what they've always done for physical threats. And I think that's a positive step.
I would just add, too, that one of the key elements to the increasing use of industrial control systems that have communications capability is just making sure that entities and corporations are aware of that capabilities and the threats associated with that. What we had found in a couple of our reviews is that the agency, and this was going back a few years, was not even familiar or did not know that its industrial control systems were actually connected to the administrative networks of the organization. And that created another avenue of access, if you will. And so understanding the threats to the technologies that are being used and how that technology is being used is going to be key to that, particularly as it relates to industrial control systems.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd. I wanted to just say to the Admiral, but pose a question as well. First of all, thank you for the stunning, and obviously I know you'll say they were doing their duty work regarding the cargo ship off the coast of Florida during a very horrific time. I don't know if the chairwoman and ranking member, it's an interest that I have because I think security involves many aspects of our work, and that we have no evidence of anything untoward, but certainly it was a tragic episode and a loss of life of many Americans. So, Mr. Admiral, I'm thankful to it, and the question I would have that you could either do in writing, or I think I have a few more minutes for you to answer, is any directions, or does the company and or the captain seek information from the Coast Guard? Are there communications ongoing that might draw the attention to come back to harbor in any situations like that?
Well, as you know, our investigation of that particular casualty is just starting under the lead of the NTSB, and those questions will certainly be asked, really the human element. What information was looked at by whom and when? Generally, though, a master of a ship of that size is not consulting with the Coast Guard with regard to his or her voyage planning.
Is not consulting?
Is not consulting with the Coast Guard with regard to their voyage planning. Obviously, they're required to let us know when they intend to make a port call, but the voyage planning is something that's left to the ship's master and the company. But as I said, our investigation with the NTSB will look into all those factors, and we'll be in a better position to let you know the specifics, hopefully in a few weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd.
And we thank the gentlelady for those comments, and we began our meeting, actually, our hearing, by thanking the Coast Guard men and women for their extraordinary service in that incident, and thoughts and prayers, obviously, to all the families of the people that had been lost. So I want to thank the witnesses, all of you, for joining us today. I think it's been a very good hearing, a very timely subject, one that is not going away. It's something that we have to pay an incredible amount of attention to. So the members of the committee might have some additional questions for the witnesses, and I would ask you all to respond to those in writing if they do put those in writing. And pursuant to the Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, thank you all again for attending, and the committee stands adjourned.